Welcome to the Dance NYC 2022 Symposium, Life Cycles, Livelihoods, Legacies. We will be with you shortly. Today's schedule. This morning, we gathered for a welcome and wake up, 10 o'clock sessions, and an 11:30 dance break presented by Kumbe Center for African and Diaspora Dance. We will now begin our 12 o'clock early afternoon sessions, followed by a nourishing lunch at 1:30. At this time, you may also explore our exhibitor hall, where we will host the virtual expo showcase. At 2:30, we will begin our late afternoon sessions, followed by a 4:15 community daily debrief, where all attendees are encouraged to attend and discuss the day's activities. And at 6 o'clock, we gather for our final keynote presentation. Accessibility. ASL interpretation and live captioning will be provided for today's session. A stream-to-text link will be posted in the chat and participation guide for access to the live transcription. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSymp, DanceNYC 2022, and DanceSymp2022. On Instagram at dance.nyc, on Twitter at dance.nyc, and on Facebook at dance/NYC. Community guidelines. Based on Dance NYC's values of justice, equity, and inclusion, we agree to share our opinions, challenge perspectives, and engage or debate respectfully, and acknowledge and course correct if harm is caused. Honor everyone's personhood and humanity. Not tolerate speech that is disparaging, abusive, violent, or that is intended to defame someone's character publicly. Some features not to miss. Build your agenda of sessions. Connect with other attendees. Join community conversations. Visit the exhibitor hall. Don't forget to check out the 2022 Symposium digital program book. We are happy to be in community with you. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Cecilia Bukowski, and I am the Research and Advocacy Coordinator for Dance NYC. I am a queer, non-disabled, mixed heritage Latinx cisgender woman of Costa Rican and Polish-Irish descent. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm coming to you from the land of the Munsee Lenape people, colonially known as Upper Manhattan. I have short, dark hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt and gold hoop earrings, and I'm sitting in front of a light-colored wood background. Thank you so much for joining us for the completely digital 2022 Dance NYC Symposium. A gentle reminder that as we're at the mercy of technology, we may experience delays, sound issues, and other interruptions during our time together. So we ask for your patience ahead of time. I'm pleased to welcome you to Advocacy 101, Navigating Public Policy for Dance Workers. The first part of this session is a workshop presentation that will serve as an introduction to policy advocacy. And the second part of the session is a panel discussion with leading advocates, moderated by Lucy Sexton. We have ASL interpreters Elisa and Beth from Sign Nexus with us today, and closed captioning services provided by Cindy from the Viscardi Center. A stream to text link will also be available and posted in the chat for further reference. Speaker information is also posted below in the program description, as well as under the speakers module on the left side of your Whova web app or the menu of your Whova mobile app. This information is also available on our website. Feel free to introduce yourself in the Whova chat and you can use the Q&A to post questions for me or for the panelists. Dance NYC moderators will be collecting questions and interacting with you in the chat. You can also follow up with us after the session on the community board in the session follow-up for Advocacy 101. Lastly, we hope that you'll help us amplify these conversations. Repost, tag us, and share your takeaways on Twitter at DanceNYC, Instagram at dance.nyc, and Facebook dance/NYC, all using the hashtag DanceSymp. That's dance, SYMP. All right, let's get started with our Advocacy 101 presentation. In the next 25 minutes or so, we'll learn some basics about navigating public policy for dance workers and explore some activities that can put you on your way to becoming a stronger, more effective advocate for yourself and for your community. I invite you to be engaged with me throughout the session. I'll be sharing some slides, as we see here, which I'll share with you in the session follow-up on the community board, along with an info sheet with an extensive resource list. During my presentation, I'll describe elements on the slides and read content from them. All the slides feature white text on a blue background with orange headers and little graphics throughout. And continuing on, just a little disclaimer, folks, I'm not a lawyer and the content of this session isn't legal advice, but we do have a legal clinic follow-up on the community board, so you can head there with your legal questions. I'd also like to take a little moment to note that I'll be using some broad terminology in specific ways. So I'd like to establish a shared vocabulary for the purposes of this session, knowing that many of the words that I'll use have multiple meanings and uses. I acknowledge off the top that advocacy can be defined and enacted in lots of different ways at many different levels, including legislative lobbying, grassroots movements, mutual aid, and community engagement. In this session, we'll be focusing specifically on policy-driven legislative advocacy. Next slide, please. So I'll start us off with this graphic that illustrates the relationships between some of the terms that we'll use today. Let's think about advocacy as an ecosystem. So this graphic shows 5 brightly colored flowers on a light blue background, and the flower in the center has roots extending downwards. Above the flowers are a bee and a group of 5 butterflies. A happy little garden just in time for spring. So what's the relationship between these elements? Well, issue-based activism is illustrated by those roots, and policy-based advocacy flourishes from the roots as a flower. Lobbying with legislators is done by our little bee, and coalitions with community and stakeholders are represented by the group of butterflies. So this garden of flowers can include multiple topics, industries, or perspectives. And for each one, the issue areas and the actions might look a little bit different. So I invite you to explore each of these components in depth with me now. Next slide, please. Everything starts at the root with your activism. Activism is issue-based. And as an activist, you might have firsthand experience with a specific issue in your life or in your community, and you might even be motivated to make some noise about it. Activism is really important for raising public awareness around real-life problems. And activists can take direct action through things like protests, strikes, and demonstrations. So anyone can be an activist. I'd like to hear a little bit from y'all. What are some issues that concern you as an activist? You can drop some ideas into the chat. I can start us off with maybe a couple of examples. Some of the issues that have affected me as a dance worker include racial justice, labor rights, and healthcare access. So what about you? I've got y'all in the chat over here on my other screen, so you're with me. We'll keep referring to our activism issues, so keep them in mind with you and carry them with you throughout the rest of the session. Oh, I see climate, immigration artist support, yes. Great, we're getting some good starting points going in the chat. So hold on to those issues and keep in mind, what your personal intersection with them is and the kinds of actions that you would like to see come from your activism. Next slide, please. So the roots of your activism can grow and flourish into the flower of advocacy, which is policy or action-based. So why is policy work important? Well, public policy shapes how resources are allocated and where they're distributed, which in turn influences social, economic, and political power dynamics at many levels. And while public policy and legislative procedures are far from perfect, they are crucial vehicles for advancing and enacting equity and justice in our communities. So advocates do the work of listening to activists and community members to sort of translate their real life issues and stories into salient requests for responsive actions that happen both within the community through things like mutual aid efforts and on the governmental level by influencing new actions or changes to public policy, legislation, budget allocations, or regulations. Ideally, advocates have experience and knowledge, both understanding the issue at hand and navigating the legislative process. So in this way, advocacy is oriented toward crafting solutions to the problems raised by activists. Anyone can be an advocate. I'd like to hear from y'all again. So what kind of public policy might impact the activism issue that you highlighted? Maybe, does anyone have an example of a bill or a law that affects you or relates to your chosen issue? You can drop some ideas into the chat. We're just brainstorming a little bit here. So if I'm recalling my advocacy issues in racial justice, labor rights, and healthcare access, I might connect those activism issues to legislation, for example, that supports reparations, like House Resolution 40, or protecting the workers' right to unionize, like in the PRO Act at the federal level. Or I might advocate for universal healthcare access as proposed in the New York Health Act. What about you? Let's see. Emission caps, yes, that relates to our climate issue. Affordable housing, public charge rule, that's something related to your immigrant artist support, Emily? Police accountability through establishing elected civilian review boards. Yes, all right. So we've got folks that are really oriented into their advocacy in the community already. This is really great to hear. All right, next slide, please. So this brings us to our bees and butterflies, our pollinators and action makers. So our little lobbying bee is the communicator, pollinator, between advocates and legislators. So they're communicating information between constituents and that governmental hive to make our legislative honey, if you will. Lobbying is defined as any attempt to influence specific legislation. You may have heard of registered big budget professional lobbyists, but the reality is that individuals and organizational advocates can lobby too. There's essentially two forms of lobbying, direct and grassroots. So direct lobbying engages with legislators who have the power to influence, enact, or block specific legislation. Grassroots lobbying, by contrast, is indirect. It engages with community, stakeholders, and coalitions to rally your broad support through campaigns to influence legislation, which can also include campaigns to have direct lobbying from your community. Now, I'll note that there are some restrictions on small-scale lobbying. For example, right now, private individuals and nonprofits in New York State can't spend more than $5,000 annually on direct lobbying efforts before having to register as a lobbyist. Chances are you're not going to run into that issue if you're running a grassroots campaign or doing things like contacting or meeting with your representatives occasionally. Either way, the first step to activating your advocacy directly with your legislators is to find out who represents the districts where you live and work. As a civically engaged constituent, you have every right and responsibility to communicate your key issues to your representatives. And you might try starting at the local level with your city council member. Next slide, please. All right, coalitions. This smattering of butterflies represents coalitions. A coalition is a group of like-minded individuals or organizations that combine their efforts to support a cause and advocate together. Coalitions can be membership-based or open to anyone in a broad or specific sector or community. Coalitions are important because they serve to unify and amplify the needs and interests of a whole field, like the dance industry, the arts and cultural sector, or the nonprofit sector. Like butterflies, coalition members work independently as pollinators to communicate within their specific communities, and together they migrate to build collective strategies, leverage relationships, and share information to influence policy through this coalition-based advocacy and lobbying. Now, coalitions can often include individuals and organizations that might not normally work together, but that are affected by the same issue or piece of legislation. So you could find yourself in coalition with folks beyond the dance or cultural sectors whose work is adjacent to yours, and your shared interests can unite you to make a stronger case to legislators. I've really enjoyed working with coalitions to sort of ideate and structure our case making for concrete proposals. And I find that having these elements in common with others in the sector and beyond my specific sector is more effective than presenting sort of scattered or divergent asks to legislators. I find that often coalitions form around specific pieces of legislation so that people in different fields can center their advocacy together. So I'd like to hear from y'all again. What is your experience being a part of a coalition? You can share some ideas in the chat. And I'll say, let's see, some examples of coalitions include the Campaign for New York Health. I'm gonna keep going back to the New York Health Act because we need it. And the A Place at the Table campaign. This is a coalition campaign to advance nonprofit lobbying. And New Yorkers for Culture and Arts also does coalition-based advocacy work with individuals and the many affinity groups in the New York City cultural sector. So if any of you have attended Culture at 3 calls, that's also a coalition space. Any other ideas? Coalition as various mutual aid groups operating in neighboring parts of New York City. Yeah, we definitely see mutual aid groups coming to the fore for specific communities and also in like emergency response situations too. All right, keep activating that chat. It's really great to have y'all in there. Next slide, please. All right, so now that we have our advocacy landscape mapped out, let's talk a little bit about timing. We've got an orange graphic over here of a calendar and a clock. to show it's important to find the right moments and opportunities to optimize the advancement of your specific advocacy efforts. And as dance workers and performers, we know very well that timing is everything. So you can start planning your advocacy first by finding out when your local, state, and federal elections are, including your primaries and special elections. You can plan advocacy activities around these moments of increased public awareness, particularly if there are candidates or measures on the ballot that connect to your central issues. So the lead up to election seasons can serve as a great time to rally awareness in your community base. Next slide, please. So once you have your timing sorted out, let's talk about engagement. Get a conversation started, as we have illustrated by these orange and white dialogue bubbles. There's lots of ways to interact with legislators. At the local level specifically, you can join your community board, or you can attend events hosted by your council member. You can also take actions like write an open letter. You can start or sign on to a petition. Email your representatives directly. You can call their offices or follow, tag, and interact with them on social media. Twitter is generally the social media platform that's used most by lawmakers. And remember also that your local representatives are your neighbors. They live and work in your district. So find out where their office is. Introduce yourself and the work you do, and get to know them and their staff, because relationships really matter. And I believe that today we may have some friends in government here with us who can also connect with you more here and in our session follow-up. So if you are a friend in government, say hi in the chat. Next slide, please. All right, so now that you have your engagement ideas, we can talk a little bit about case making. Get out the bullhorn for this one. So to make your case to legislators, I want to highlight two important elements to consider: data and storytelling. So data might seem a little bit dry at first, but the numbers and findings that are collected by the government and by independent entities through surveys, research studies, data reports, and the census, those can all present powerful indicators and hard evidence about the issues that you're raising. I'll also highlight Dance NYC's own research that you can cite specifically for the New York City dance community. You can browse that on our website. So with data, there's essentially two kinds of data: quantitative, that's represented by numbers and statistics, and qualitative, that deals with more like words and ideas. So for example, you can use quantitative economic impact data to demonstrate the concrete value of your community's economic contributions or historic underinvestments. And you'll be speaking in terms that legislators can really relate to. And then you can use qualitative data to demonstrate things like the positive impacts of arts education on student achievement. And that piece of qualitative data sort of leads me into that second component of case making in storytelling. Dancers are storytellers by nature, so let's play off of those skills. Don't underestimate the power of you and your community members' personal experiences. Letting legislators know about the specific real-life implications of your issue area and the potential positive impacts of the support that you're requesting, that can really put a human face to your issue. For example, if you're trying to make the case for relief for the cultural sector, you might cite the COVID-related closure of a local dance studio in your neighborhood, or that many of your colleagues have had to relocate because they couldn't afford to live in New York City in an uncertain economic climate during the pandemic. I know that's happened to a lot of people. And these real-life stories matter, and they matter to your legislators because they represent you. Next slide, please. All right, legislative advocacy. So this piece requires the tracking of the progress of bills through the legislative process. Each bill has sponsors that introduce the bill and co-sponsors that then endorse it. So your sponsors and co-sponsors can help rally more support in the legislature. So they're key people to contact when you're doing your advocacy work and your direct lobbying. Contacting those sponsors and co-sponsors can then lead to more growth and support for the bill. You'll also want to track the legislative session and committee activities for the government body that you're looking to impact. And you can also stay informed about upcoming public hearings of legislative committees. We'll have a bunch of resources in our info sheet in the follow-up that can link you to the information around committees and legislative sessions. Next slide, please. All right, budget advocacy. If you're advocating for budget-related measures, such as like increased funding allocations to a specific agency or program, you'll want to prepare around the budget calendar for the appropriate government body. So in Congress, you have your House and Senate budget committees. In the state legislature, you have the Assembly Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Committee on Finance. And at the city council level, also the Committee on Finance. And handily enough, the budget calendars at the federal, state, and local levels are sequential and overlapping in nature, as we have illustrated by this graphic of 3 sequential arrows, this circular graphic. So this is because the federal budget allocations directly impact state resources, and then down the line to the local level. The federal budget is generally adopted in October, the state budget in April, and the local budget in June. This timeline follows the fiscal year cycle for each body, although there can sometimes be delays in the budget adoption process, particularly at the federal level. We just had a federal budget pass earlier this month, for example. So each budget goes through a similar process of preliminary development, amendments, and executive approval. And at every level of the government, the executive, that's the president, the governor, or the mayor, they draft a preliminary budget. And then the legislative bodies, Congress, state Senate and Assembly, and city council, they go through a round of amendments based on their constituent priorities. That's a great time to insert some of your direct budget lobbying. So then that amended budget goes back to the executive for approval and adoption. The process isn't always smooth, but this gives you a general idea of how to plan your budget advocacy timeline sort of throughout the year. All right, next slide, please. All right, that about wraps up my presentation. And I know it was kind of a lot of information. I'm happy to keep following up with y'all in our session follow-up on the community board. And we'll also drop a link in the chat to a PDF of my slides from this presentation and to our Advocacy 101 information sheet. That has a whole bunch of links to resources on the elements that we discussed today. We'll put those resources into the follow-up as well. And we'll continue to field your questions and engage in conversation during the panel discussion. I'm just gonna take a little peek at this chat. See what's going on. All right, thank you so much for engaging today. All right, let's see. So this brings us into the panel portion of our session. A reminder that you can drop your questions into the Whova Q&A and stay active in the chat. And I will pass things over with that to the illustrious Lucy Sexton to lead us in the discussion. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Fabulous presentation. Sarah, if you have not interacted with Sarah before, is an amazing advocacy worker and dancer and all of those good things. I am Lucy Sexton, she, her. As an accessibility check, I'll give you a visual description. I have a white polka dot, white with tiny black polka dot button-down shirt, black reading glasses, short brown hair, sitting in a room with some walls far behind me and some art on the walls. I have lived my whole life in Lenape-Hoking. I Currently, I'm a dancer and choreographer, director, and I currently lead the Cultural Advocacy Coalition, New Yorkers for Culture and Arts. I'm going to introduce our panel right now. The question that we are going to ask them, in addition to just sort of giving their visual description and name and pronoun and affiliation, is what their current advocacy focus is. So I'll just throw out there that New Yorkers for Culture and Arts, just as Sarah was just describing the budget process, we are neck deep in advocacy for cultural funding at the state level, and then going into turning our focus at the city level. So that's where I'm at right now, but lots of things to talk about. And we're going to talk, after I introduce everybody, we'll talk for 15 minutes maybe, and then throw it open to question answer. Would love to have this be more of a dialogue. I know it's a lot of information coming at you. Okay, first up, I'm going to introduce Diane Freyr. She writes and directs narrative feature films about contemporary Native Americans. She's currently finishing her feature film, The Heart Stays, so look out for that. She's the founder of the American Indian Artists, Inc., also known as AMERINDA, which is the only Native multidisciplinary arts organization of its kind in the United States. Welcome, Diane.
Hi, Lucy. Yes, you have to give me a minute with Zoom always, a few seconds anyway. Yes, I'm Diane Freyr. I'm from Osage, born on Osage Nation, tribally enrolled person, and also have documented Cherokee heritage as well. So those folks moved in, married, and became part of my family, so I always acknowledge them as well. Let me see, I have dark hair. And I'm wearing a turquoise necklace and some turquoise earrings, and my hair is, I guess, a little medium going towards long length. And I have, you can see some nice, very colorful artwork on the walls and back. And I'm very happy to be here. And I just want to say briefly that I thank everyone involved in this symposium for all the hard work that they've done for all of us. Before I forget it, I just want to acknowledge that. And also like to say that my principal area, I don't like to prioritize it because Native people see things as the interconnectedness of everything. So I would say cultural equity, and within that framework, equity for all people. And all marginalized people have faced erasure on multiple levels. And so a victory for one of us is a victory for all of us, and we have to support one another as well. So.
Thank you so much, Diane. This is Lucy again to introduce our next panelist. Kimberly Olsen is the executive director of the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. Kim has had a prolific career as a teaching artist, working with students from pre-K up through adult in over 50 schools across the tri-state area, and a particular focus in working with students with disabilities. Welcome, Kim.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Hi, everybody. My name is Kimberly Olsen. I use she, her pronouns. And as Lucy said, I am a teaching artist, and I'm also the executive director of the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. And currently I'm calling in from Peachtree Corners, Georgia, visiting family, which is the ancestral and unceded lands of the Cherokee people. In my organization, the Roundtable, our current advocacy focus is advocating for universal access to arts education for all New York City students. I'm very happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Kim. All right, our next panelist is the Associate Director of Advocacy and Policy at the Asian American Federation. He leads advocacy efforts across the city and the state. Please welcome Ravi Reddi.
Thank you for having us. Thanks so much, Sarah, for that amazing presentation beforehand. I'm Ravi Reddi. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Associate Director of Advocacy and Policy at the Asian American Federation, calling in from Brooklyn, the unceded lands of the Lenape people. Basic visual description, I'm wearing a dark green shirt with brown caramel eyeglasses. I'm a bald brown man with curtains and a white background. And one of our big, as with every year, to Diane's point is, we're fighting for increased funding for, the Asian community at the city and state level, but also increased mental health funding across communities of color and marginalized communities, understanding that the recent wave of anti-Asian hate isn't an Asian problem, it's an all of us problem, and it informs everything that our marginalized communities have had to go through on their own without the support of the government who we fund. I could go in a rant mode, but that's it. I'm glad to be here.
We look forward to your rant, Ravi. Bring it. Okay, and finally, our final panelist is Rebecca Fitton, who works in the dance field as an artist, scholar, administrator, and an advocate. Among others, she works with Will Rawls and Adrian Westward, among other choreographers, and is a member of the Dance Artists National Collective, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and other advocacy groups. Please welcome Rebecca Fitton.
Hello, everybody. I will say good morning because it is still morning where I am, which is the lands of the Ohlone people, past, present, and future. I am a mixed race Asian American queer neurodivergent person with a short brown bob and bangs. I'm wearing a black shirt with white ginkgo leaves, and the apartment behind me is blurred. Like Lucy said, I'm an independent arts manager, an advocate. I will also add that I identify as an audience member, which feels especially precious these days in the ways which we're showing up to our community, both in policy and in performance spaces. And I'm also a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. My advocacy focus these days is broadly around arts and culture funding mechanisms. I also focus on fair working conditions and labor practices for freelance dancers through my work with DANC. And then because I spend a lot of time in Texas, I'm also focusing on reproductive justice in those communities, specifically in Asian American communities in Texas. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. I think sometimes in advocacy discussions, it can all get a little overwhelming, a lot of information, and you don't need to do it all, right? The goal is to go, how can I get involved in some way in work that I'm interested in? And so I thought I might throw it out to the panel to begin with of just you personally. When did you start to get involved in advocacy work? What was that kind of your path to it of, sort of when it went from something in your head until you said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Usually it happens in a lot of different ways over the course of our lives. But if anybody could share any personal stories of what kind of motivated you and how you entered it when you were motivated. Anyone want to give us a start?
I'll jump in. This is Rebecca speaking. I am an immigrant. And so I moved here and grew up in what we now know as the United States, not thinking that I would ever be able to vote here, which as a kid was my main understanding of how advocacy could work. But as I grew older, I learned, and my parents were very supportive of finding the ways in which you can advocate for your communities with different legal statuses, specifically around citizenship. And that really helped me think about moving past just voting as an act of advocacy, but thinking about how we can show up to our communities in other ways. Eventually, I became a citizen, and that changed, right, my legal ability to show up. But it really fermented an interesting way to think about what our identities are able to offer to this conversation outside of legal residency.
And also you're talking about some barriers for you, right?
Yeah.
When you are not a citizen, it can be scary to sort of start to engage in advocacy. And you said your parents encouraged you to do it?
Yes. Yeah. Certainly coming from England, which is the country that I immigrated from, there's a certain amount of privilege and power in understanding the right to rights. Mm-hmm. And so that helped as well.
Fabulous. Great. Anyone else want to jump in?
I can jump in, Lucy. Hi, I just wanted to say that as coming from a Native community, I think it's fair to say that there was never a time from growing up there that where you didn't, where you weren't not aware of what has come to be called advocacy. The Native people are constantly resisting public policy that infringes upon their sovereignty and perpetuates policies that hurt them. So it's normal for, like, for example, a Native nation to be in court working on something, working its way up to the Supreme Court, 2 or 3 things at one time, and then and standing up to things that the policies that the government tries to put into place or doesn't remove, that are old and destructive, or permits corporations and institutions to perpetuate injustices. So that's just really a way of life in the tribally and rural community. And I also think it's really important also too that that's the place where Native people are there. Native people come to the city to live, to pursue various dreams, just like everybody else does. But the heart of what that means to be is there on the nation. So we have a traditional culture and not a pop culture. And so the defense of that culture and the perpetuation of it and the caring and the nurturing of that comes down to how you want to live your life and what you teach the young people, and the perpetuation of those traditional values is what we define ourselves by. So when we started AMERINDA, we said that it would be, you had to be a tribally enrolled person, it's in the bylaws to be on the board of directors, and that you we work with the tribally enrolled community, in particular with people who are from the Native nations. So to affirm those traditional values in the way we are with other people and the way we are with one another. So that's
super, super interesting. And amazing to just lift up that as a Native person, you're always, you're always fighting. It's really, really good to keep that in mind. But your particular entry point was also around culture, right? As you were saying, like to take that part of it and say, no, we need to forefront that in some way, and in terms of the founding of AMERINDA.
Well, yes, that we had AMERINDA is based on traditional Native values. It's not based on like the demands of a certain artistic discipline or something. It's grounded. The platform art is traditional Native values, and it's led, staffed, and directed by people that are tribally enrolled people. So. Right. So this is what stabilizes us, and this is what enables us to get a lot of things accomplished that we're constantly being told that you can't do that or it wouldn't work and so on and so forth. And we end up doing them. And it's because we apply those values to whatever we do.
Fabulous. And
that brings a different kind of result for us. Would for anybody, but it does for us for sure.
Super interesting.
Remember, it's not pop culture. That's different.
That's right. Yep. Understood. No, I'd love to hear more of those stories. Ravi, do you want to give us your story or
Sure.
What happened to you?
Sure. So, I went to graduate school first for social work and then for public policy. And what I realized when I got into advocacy was that there's a very different language you need to be able to speak with. There is an element of learning to translate all of these what you read in the textbooks into conversation. And I think at the Asian American Federation, one thing that really resonates with me is what Diane said around focusing on reinforcing our community first and building out from there the internal work and the external work. And so for us, we're a convening organization of 70 grassroots Asian-led, Asian-serving nonprofits. But that's not to say that while we are reinforcing internally, we are not projecting and building coalitions externally. And one thing I find, one thing I'm thinking about right now is just, we advocate a lot on behalf of the substantial majority population of the Asian community that is immigrants. But I think one thing that, I'm really interested in hearing more about is in particular, the identities of, Diane's organization and the native defense of, their communities, and also the shared kind of the tragic, commonalities in the fights that immigrants are fighting, as well as Native people are fighting, and the common targets of our advocacy and the common defenses we're putting up, and how we're trying to reinforce our own communities while also, projecting externally in defense of them, and how we find those relationships across these communities. I think it's beautiful and complicated at the same time. So I'm just wanted to raise that up, that I'm constantly finding new reasons to love this work, and just excited to be here.
It's great. You make a really good point about the internal, looking inside, and then also facing outwards, and building coalitions in both spaces. And we're going to talk more about coalitions in just a second. Kimberly, Kim, you want to jump in?
Sure thing. Before I share about my advocacy story, that moment spark for me, just to give a visual description as well. I'm a pale-skinned white woman. I'm wearing clear framed glasses with long brown hair. And I'm wearing a denim jacket, and I have a flat brownish tan wall behind me. And I will say, for me, in terms of how I got started in this work, really the COVID-19 pandemic was a catalyst for me. I was working as a teaching artist in 5 different schools at the time, and also working part-time at the Roundtable, which in March 2020 was doing primarily professional development. Mm-hmm. And then overnight, as so many of us know, work was canceled. There was so much uncertainty happening around us. Nobody knew what the pathway forward was going to be. Yet the Roundtable had consistently, we're a service organization that supports hundreds of organizations across New York City and thousands of artists. So instinctually, in the way that people have come to us for community, they immediately came to us saying, can we connect with others? And that Thursday, we put together a Zoom call that had 100 people on the call, because at the time we didn't know Zoom had audience limits. And it was so that moment of hearing from our community members, the uncertainty, the need and desire to continue working in schools and communities, the need to focus the art at that time, and also uncertainty about whether people would be paid and be able to continue to sustain a living, is what ultimately brought me and the Roundtable to better focus this work in what we were doing, and do it in a more formal sense. So that was very much the catalyzing moment, where I'd always been an advocate for my students, but it was transitioning those skills of educating and organizing into a broader external framework as well.
You made so many good points, and I want to follow up on it, maybe draw others into the conversation, because, well, first of all, I don't want to let that one go, because I always tell dancers this, and in fact, other kinds of arts students as well in my teaching, is that you have every skill you need. Like, when we are used to teaching and producing dance work and producing theater work and, and our own work, and having to advocate for our own work, we have all the skills we need. We have really good skills if we want to go into the advocacy space. We know what we're doing. So just want to lift that up. And you certainly, I can't believe that it only started really for you the really advocacy coming to the fore in the pandemic, because I look at you like, oh, that's my idol. Kim knows how to lead the organization and get the things out there and communicate well. So congratulations and thank you for your work. I wonder about that with everyone. How did the pandemic, how did COVID, when we went into the shutdown 2 years ago? I know for a lot of dance artists and individual independent artists, it was a time, because also you didn't have work, that you needed the advocacy, and you needed to figure out how you were getting paid, as you said. And it was a time when there was an upsurge in advocacy, certainly among independent artists. And I'm really interested in how we now keep that going, because it's hard, particularly for independent arts workers, because you got to work, you don't have the time. So, but anyone else on the panel want to talk about how the moment of the shutdown, the ongoing pandemic, shifted, either in a good way or a bad way, your advocacy efforts? I'll jump in and start from me. That was absolutely, like, I had been doing New Yorkers for Culture and Arts 2 years part-time, and then the shutdown happened, and Taryn Sacramone of Queen's Theater and the Cultural Institutions Group started these daily calls. And then she threw it open for whoever wanted to participate, any cultural organization to participate. It wasn't for independent artists, but any cultural organization. I started on that. And, you know, the need to be together, to share information, first of all, gave us a platform. And second of all, as you say, we needed things. We needed to figure out how we were going forward. We needed to interact with government in terms of when we still do, what rules affect us, how does the shutdown affect us, how can we survive this time? So it certainly amplified the work of New Yorkers for Culture and Arts in my experience. Anyone else?
I have something.
Yeah.
I found that as a marginalized community, we were used to constantly having to adapt. So for us, this was yet another thing. It was a big thing, but we've had to adapt to a lot of large things. So we just kept trying to stabilize every step as we went, step by step forward. What for us is been even more trying, I think, and there was support that the government did try to offer to people, so we weren't abandoned, all of us. So I think that's important, that there was payroll protection. There were some efforts made to try to help people, and as with all huge bureaucracies, they're hard to get through, but a lot of us got through them. So, and they've helped on many levels, I think, since then too. But for us, which is really been daunting, is the other end of it, is trying to emerge out of it and get the momentum that every community and organization has to have to sustain their work, to raise that, and to just get enough support coming in to recover, pick up the work that needs to be finished, and then envision a future, something that you're going to keep doing here and and still adjusting at the same time. Without a lot of other requirements, but that really it was much more exhausting. The emergence out of it has been really hard. And I know it has to be for everybody. So I'm not saying that we it was just us. I'm just saying that's how
it's a really good thing to lift up. We are all exhausted.
Yes.
It is a tough moment. So yes, it is hard to sort of lift up and go, okay, now I get more energy for coming out of it. Ravi, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think to Diane's point, I think one thing the pandemic showed was at once it made our advocacy easier and more challenging. Challenging in the sense that adaptation is always challenging, especially in marginalized communities. We're in a constant state of adaptation. Like, our goal is first to stabilize our community because our community has never known normalcy. So that was a challenging part. And the other side of the coin is that it made it easier because the pandemic made it undeniable for anyone to ignore what our communities have been going through, just how inaccessible assistance is, just how language inaccessible government processes are, how, cultural competence was, it showed that for all the good ideas we have, they were thought with us in mind, but they weren't implemented with us in mind. And the pandemic made that undeniably clear. So in two ways, it made the logistics of actual advocacy challenging, but at the same time, it made it very clear that the pandemic is showing what we've been saying for decades. And so I think I just want to raise that up too.
No, absolutely right. It just, if there was ever any veil on it, it pulled that veil off to the inequities in the system and the real damage that the system does on a regular basis. Rebecca, I want to bring you in just because, especially as a more of an independent artist and engaging with advocacy. How did you experience this? Any other reflections on what the other panelists have been saying?
Yeah, I will echo the feeling of a veil being moved. I think my reflection as, an independent freelance artist is that I was literally flying back from Tallahassee, Florida, into New York when everything started shutting down. And my career geographically before the pandemic was very all over the place. I was in Florida, I was in New York, I was in Wisconsin. And so in some ways prohibited my ability to focus in very specifically on issues in a specific geographic region. And I'm still teasing this out a little bit for myself, but when I think about my peers who have these multi-geographical careers that are their sources of income, it makes advocacy like specificity, because it's so tied to place, often difficult. And so now, as I'm again back all over the place, and I live in Austin and I'm in California right now, but a lot of the choreographers I work for are still in New York. How do I balance paying attention to the advocacies that are coming up in all my places of work with as much care, while balancing the need to survive and make money? And so the pandemic revealed some of that and also made it difficult and made it easier in some ways. And it still remains very complicated. Yeah.
No, I think you lift up exactly, the experience of a lot of independent artists, is you're working specifically in different places, but even a regular, even if you're staying in one place, you're a gig worker, you're working lots of different things. And it's very hard to just have the time to do it. Have the resources to do any advocacy. I want to throw it out to any questions and experiences that anyone watching wants to share in I think it's the Whova chat or the Q&A. Because this is, I know that people watching this are folks who have been engaging in advocacy as independent artists, and I'm just wondering any reflections that they have or questions for us, but of this moment of how can we, as you just said, how do we still find time and which issues and what localities of those issues, how do we figure out how to keep things moving forward that we saw the need for so much in this time of crisis. So I'm going to ask folks to enter any questions, comments, your own experiences, etc. One thought I had, and just get me those questions as you can. Our wonderful staff, our Dance NYC chat staff and production team. Thank you for that, for all your work on this symposium. Others in this panel, in terms, you talked about, Ravi, about working from within. And one thing I feel like is my responsibility is that, okay, I'm being paid to do this, right? So I have a job, and how do I make it so that the ones I know who do not have the time and are not being paid to do it get their voice heard, at least to me, and then that gets amplified out. Anybody with experience of that? I mean, you must have it, Kim, in terms of teaching artists who are always gig workers. How can we strengthen our accountability to our constituencies and to let people know that we're a resource?
This is Kim speaking. I can jump right in because it's something that, especially now as we're in a very different place than we were 2 years ago. Well, I think we still are very much in the pandemic. School residencies have begun. Community partnerships have restarted. Work is starting to come back by and large within the arts and education space. However, for teaching artists, those gig workers, time is money. So any time spent away from their work, whether it be their artistry or their pedagogy, means that they're taking away resources to being able to fund their sustainability as a working and thriving artist. So what's been important for us is to provide multiple access points at varying degrees of, I don't want to say intensity, but different types of touch points. So we'll offer anything from a social media toolkit where we have a graphic for you and we have copy that you can paste on your social media within 2 minutes to show your solidarity within our coalition's movement. Or we also will do a one-click form that will take no less than a couple minutes to complete as well. But then we also like to invite opportunities for peer exchange within community open spaces or community conversations, and also making sure we're always extending an invitation when we have opportunities like a city council meeting, ensuring that that goes out to our full e-blast list with instructions on how to do it, with an open invitation to contact myself, to ask questions, because we know so many people are new to exercising this advocacy muscle. What we've also found is that this advocacy work naturally, there's an exchange that happens within our regular programming, which is professional development. And oftentimes those spaces, just by nature of being artists and educators, inherently turn into advocacy spaces where we're advocating not only for ourselves as artists, but advocating, like I said, for our students, the communities that we serve. And in turn, that then helps to inform our priorities as an organization as well. And what we found is sometimes organizations will pay for teaching artists to then attend our professional developments, which has been a great way, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, for them to be able to provide some sort of wage to their teaching artists, for TAs then to be able to prepare to teach in our new world. And yeah, we're continuing, I think, to figure out what that means for us, but just a few different ways that we're now offering touch points for people to get involved in the work.
Well, and you make the point, which I really think is key, is that you're programming already. People are coming to you for other reasons than advocacy. They're coming to you because they're getting professional development or other resources. And then that becomes, first of all, you have a relationship with them. So you're hearing from them what their experience in the field is. So that can lead to advocacy as well. I'm wondering if other organizations that do programming, I know AMERINDA has a lot of programming that has nothing to do with advocacy. I don't know if Asian American Federation, same. Any thoughts on that relationship between your programming and then the advocacy wing of what you do?
Yeah, so as I said before, we're a convening organization of 70 Asian-led, Asian-serving nonprofits. They all do direct service work in any number of issue areas: senior services, mental health services, everything that's needed by our communities. Our community organizations are doing it. But I do want to say that advocacy takes on so many different looks. And right now, as we're navigating anti-Asian hate, to be Asian, to be an immigrant, to be an Asian woman, to be an Asian elder is a daily act of rebellion and solidarity in its own way. And to seek out mental health services from our organizations while fighting cultural stigma, to do it is an act of solidarity and an act of advocacy and a vote of confidence in why funding needs to reach our mental health providers. And so there are so many different ways that just in our daily actions, we're encouraging Asian Americans to continue advocating. It's not just calling your council member, although that does help. It's not just calling your elected officials, although that does help. It's funding, it's participating in mutual aid efforts. It's just a small daily acts that cumulatively show that the Asian American community and marginalized communities are a force to be reckoned with, that organizing internally should be exactly what elected officials should be catching their eyes and that they should be advocating for. So there is so many ways that we're trying to incorporate advocacy into just making sure people understand that it is exactly what Sarah talked about, but also there's so many small acts every day that to live as an artist is difficult and a sign of expressing solidarity and advocacy for why it shouldn't be that difficult to exist as an artist. I think there's a way that we're working, that we're communicating that, and that it's well understood already. It's just highlighting it, that you are an advocate already.
Yes, that living loud and proud in the life you live is already an act of advocacy. And Ravi, you're a perfect person for me to throw this question from Hastings Hill, who's watching. Currently work in a 501c3. When we seek funding, one of the primary requirements is that we don't operate in the lobbying space. Can you speak to the conflict of wanting to directly impact policy change as an individual or as an organization without jeopardizing your nonprofit status?
I believe Nonprofit NY, of which Dance NYC is part of that coalition, is working on lobbying reforms to make it easier for nonprofits to advocate on behalf of their communities. So I think that's a great question. I think for us, as individuals, it can, reflecting your daily concerns towards elected officials. I think there are small ways you can do it. I would love to speak more deeply, maybe offline, and hear from others about how their nonprofits are navigating that. But there are ways to create mass movements without jeopardizing your nonprofit status. And I do think that's an overarching question that a number of coalitions are navigating, is 501c3 shouldn't be looking over their shoulders when we're doing exactly the advocacy work that's needed to push our community forward.
Thank you, Ravi. I was thinking of you because I see you on the Nonprofit New York calls. I am one of the people working on that thing, so maybe I should just step forward into it, because Sarah mentioned earlier a piece of legislation called A Place at the Table. The truth is, you are absolutely welcome to do a certain amount of lobbying. Lobbying is going to your city council and saying, we need more funding for arts and culture, and you're allowed to do it. It's no problem with your 501c3. You can't say, you know, my organization, my dance company supports this person for city council. That's partisan, but you absolutely can advocate and lobby for support for your organization, for certain policies to be passed, et cetera. You have a cap, which is that you can spend up to $5,000 of your time and energy on it, right? So if you pay yourself $100 an hour, you could do 50 hours on this. If you pay yourself less than that, then you can do that much more without worrying about it at all. The Place at the Table campaign is asking for the state to lift that lobbying threshold to $10,000, because what it does, that threshold, is it does exactly what's happening to you, Hastings, which is that you get scared of it. You're like, oh no, I can't. You don't have to worry about it. You are allowed to do it, and you should do it robustly, right? If you find yourself spending, 10 hours a week on it, then you may need to register. Even still, your 501c3 is okay, right? You just have to acknowledge it. And you say, oh yeah, so New Yorkers for Culture and Arts, it's a nonprofit. And then I over here say, yes, and I also register as a lobbyist because I spend X amount of time doing it, and I fill out some forms. So it's a pain, and we should lift that lobbying threshold, but you should not worry about it. And with funders, one of the words to use is education. And you are allowed to do that. You are allowed to go testify at a public hearing for the city council and educate them on the value of your work, on the value of culture to New York City. If you don't say, and I ask you to give $30 million more, then you're not even lobbying. You are just educating them. This is how my sector works. This is the value I bring to my dance students. This is the value I bring to my neighborhood. Any of that stuff is purely education. So, and you can belong to other advocacy groups. I will stop talking, but are these numbers and legalities for New York or New Jersey too? I don't know New Jersey specifics, but in general, this is 501c3 is a federal designation. And so lots of these are, in the same area. Basically, you cannot be partisan. You cannot endorse a particular candidate unless you're a political action committee and you're not a 501c3, you're a 501c4. But 501c3s can absolutely educate and advocate. And it's not only you can, we must. That's why it's called A Place at the Table. If we're not at the table, then the only people they're hearing from are the lobbyists for corporations, right? They need to be hearing from nonprofits. They need to be hearing from the cultural sector. We need to not live in fear of this. But I know your boards may be afraid of it. Your funder may give you cautions about it. Talk about education, talk about advocacy, talk about, representing the community. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead. Diane, jump in.
Oh, I was going to say, just if it's helpful to people in the Native community, the Native people see themselves as related to one another. So when you see another Native American Indian, you see them as your relative. Okay, so and so we know each other on like I said, multiple layers, because we see the interconnectedness too of everything. So people are raised to positions like through consensus from the community, to be able to carry the message, you see, from the community to who they want to carry to. And there's two, when we talk with other people, there's two things we always say. Number one, talk to people who are known by and accountable to the people they profess to serve. And the other one is, if you're interested in change for the better on anything, talk to the people who've been hurt by it first, because they know what they need. There's too many people deciding for other people what they need, and they don't even know those people. So that enters the process. And it occurs to me, seeing all the lovely people from the greater dance community, that dancers are members of the dance family. Okay. And that's Nettie people, we put the emphasis on the extended family. Well, that's part of your extended family. If you're a dancer, it's the other dancers. You may be a member of the ballet clan, or you may be a member of the modern dance clan, or the traditional dance clan that you brought from wherever your folks came from when they came here. But you're still a member of that extended family. So the more you interact with one another, the more you get the consensus that you need then for the people who have the time, or the people you ask to do it for you, to be on solid ground with something going forward. And the more consistent the message is to the people who claim to be listening to us. And another thing is you have to keep talking. There's never a point where this stuff is so hard. In other words, it's ongoing. We have to keep talking about it all the time. We just keep talking about it. So, and then over time, some things change and a little more like that. So if that's helpful to people.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Rebecca speaking. I'm in grad school, so stick with me a little bit as I go on a theoretical bent. But I'm thinking about what Diane said about interaction and talking to each other, and also Hastings' question, and the fear that Lucy mentioned that we might overstep our boundaries, or that we should stay in one lane. And I want to cite the folks at Decolonizing Wealth, who remind us that the 501c3 is a figment of white supremacy, and it is asking us to remain siloed in one lane. And so the way we can resist is by interacting, is by addressing this fear that we have that we're going to step out of line, because it's only whiteness that is asking us to be one thing at a time. And yes, there are these, legal boundaries around what specifically we can do. And the legislation that Lucy has been talking about is great in addressing that. And also, we can think a little bit more outside of how whiteness affects this kind of work. And the real act of resisting, like Diane said, is to think expansively about our roles. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
I really appreciate it. And absolutely, we need to be brave, and we need to call it for what it is. I mean, our last governor, wanted to reduce the threshold to 500. Why? Because he didn't want to hear from nonprofits. So, it's absolutely a tool. So, and a tool of intimidation as well. So thank you for saying that. We're coming to our last little bit, and I want to throw out two things. One, we've talked about coalition, like Asian American Federation is a coalition of Asian organizations of all different kinds. New York Culture and Arts Coalition of cultural organizations and independent artists and cultural workers. What about coalition building across, with others who, we probably don't agree with on every front, but we're going to join about something, and maybe not to do with culture. Maybe it is, like Sarah said, maybe it's about the New York Healthcare Act. Maybe it's about, $15 an hour minimum wage at the national level. The power of building coalition with people in other sectors, right? Because we live our lives. We're not just artists and dancers. We are also citizens. How the subways affects us, where we should be engaged in this conversation around public safety. All of those things are, because we live here as well. And how to, if anyone has any experience of building coalition across sectors, I will And the second thing, and maybe this is more, this is something Diane was just raising up that is really one of my big lessons of advocacy is, and what you're saying too, Rebecca, it's a long game. You know, you may say something and you may think, well, every year we talk about, you know, individual artists getting access to DCLA money. Every year we talk about it, but then all of a sudden something shifts and it happens, you know, or maybe it happens a little bit and then it goes away. Like, you have to keep in it, and you have to trust that the work you're doing, even if it doesn't pay off in the immediate, pays off it has the ability, if you keep, you know, connecting those dots and you stay in it, as you say, to pay off in the long run. Certainly the Native community knows this. This is not you cannot look at the short-term gains because they are often too heartbreaking. So anyone ask a question? Okay, I'm going to be quiet and let anyone else jump in, and then I'll look at another question in the chat. Okay, this is from Poetry, and anyone who would like to jump in on it. I'd like to ask a question about using the discrediting of work of a tradition bearer, right? And I'm going to guess that this is, well, anybody can open it, but that, and I'm going to extrapolate Poetry and continue to write to tell me that I'm getting it right or wrong. That it is not, that traditional work, traditional cultural work is not considered of the same value. Is that what we're talking about? You know, in terms of whether we're talking about choreography or other more Western phraseology around it. My cat is very interested in this discussion. Any thoughts on any of the three things I just raised up?
I just like to throw in this, like, what, if I understand it correctly, please correct me if I don't, okay?
Yeah.
Like I said at the beginning, that our whole pathway, the Native community, is grounded in the traditional culture. So we have traditional theater, we have traditional storytelling, we have contemporary Native American theater, and we have the traditional design aesthetic, and which inspired American abstract expressionism, I might add. And then we have artists working in contemporary expression. So I think that respect and balance should be extended to all peoples. Certainly.
And yes, and you make a great point, right? We need to also raise up our history, right? That abstract art comes from looking at Native forms,
Yeah,
right? And to make those
Native
connections.
design. Yeah.
Yep. It's a history of African work, also.
Yes, on the Cubist.
Yeah. So, you know, just keeping that knowledge going. Can there be a help to give tradition bearers from being attacked academically? And absolutely necessary. And you know, it's again, it's a story of who is in the conversation, but certainly as Rebecca was saying, we all can do something. We all can make sure we know history and we raise our voices, even in everyday conversation. So it's an interesting.
Can I say something?
Go ahead. Yep.
I think it's good for everyone to say, all marginalized people to say that it's just a little tool. As I think of these things, I'm throwing them out there to help people, to support them, is that remind people that our folks, marginalized people, have not been allowed to speak for themselves. And we have been defined, and we have had forced assimilation thrust upon us. So, you know, later for these academics, I mean, you have to remind people that part of people's recovery is to speak for themselves and define what matters to them.
Beautifully said.
I think to a previous question, at least said that I'm tying just back into Diane's response. I think it's also understanding that in the context of history, it's, you know, especially when we're navigating anti-Asian hate and all the ways that manifests, it's understanding that this is just another chapter in a long, unfortunate textbook on hate, against marginalized communities and tying our experiences to the experiences of other communities. Our Hope Against Hate campaign actually draws lessons from the Black community and the trans communities about how they've created a culture of safety from within their own communities. So broadly extrapolating from there and understanding that anti-Asian hate is in the same book as what has happened to the Native peoples, what has happened to Muslims after 9/11, what has happened to immigrant communities throughout history, and finding those common threads is the first place to start before we actually start acting. And that organizing requires that it's not just, at least for us, an Asian problem, but understanding that there are so many other communities that have shared this experience or have encountered white supremacy from another direction, that there are plenty of lessons that we can draw if we apply the lessons of history appropriately. And I think just finding those common themes is incredibly important in building solidarity in tangible ways when it comes to advocacy, whether that's, traditional marginalized communities, dancers, and other professions, and how it manifests in these professions. I think it's incredibly important in how we apply the lessons of history and how we're willing to open ourselves up to the experience of other people.
Rebecca, were you wanting to jump in?
Yeah, I also thank you, Ravi, for that reflection. I also wanted to add, as someone who's invested in an academic institution right now, that policy also exists in that space. And as Kimberly was saying earlier, there are multiple touch points to engage in advocacy work in an institution. So my acts of resistance are challenging syllabus, or they're speaking up in class and saying this work is not necessary to continue this conversation anymore. In a nonprofit, it's challenging bylaws. It's being on boards and saying that is also an act of policy. It is an act of policing bodies. And so how can we push forward on all the different iterations of policy that exist in our lives outside of the various government agencies? Thanks.
I would also say that we also need it can be so overwhelming, right? Another Asian person is attacked and you just are sort of, how can I do anything? I feel like there are organizations who are working on this. First up, go find someone that you can support their work, right? Not everybody has to do everything themselves. And conversely, and additionally, I would say, and you have every right to reach out to that organization. You have every right to reach out to New Yorkers for Culture and Arts about whatever is impacting you and say, are you guys addressing, rent stabilization? Like this is really impacting the dancers that I work with, and we're going to have to leave New York. So, you have every right to engage with organizations that are in this work. You don't need to do it all yourself, but you also don't need to feel totally overwhelmed and powerless either. So, and of course, I love the thing of, yes, and we should be talking to people who it impacts. Go ahead, Ravi.
And to put a point on it, this work has been done for generations. There are experts on the ground. There are experts who have inculcated in marginalized communities the lessons that we just need to apply in a different way today. So I want to put a finer point on that the work has already been done. It's how are you going to get on the on-ramp to the existing work that's already been done? We're drawing lessons at the same time that we're trying to apply them in this culturally specific way. Mm-hmm. So I just had to say that.
Love it. Yeah, absolutely. Other comments? Thoughts around this really important discussion? I mean, that's just my thing of, I just don't want people to feel overwhelmed because, as you say, there are already people working on it, and you can engage with them. All right. Any victories, inspiring stories of coalition that anyone or advocacy that because we know the problems are so huge and can be overwhelming. I will start with two small examples. One was that I went to a memorial service for a woman, Jane Stern, who used to be at New York Community Trust. She was the one who first founded the New York City Immigrant Coalition. Funded them, gave them money to do it. And she was a fierce advocate on behalf of public education, and that New York City public education students should receive the same amount of money as kids in the suburbs. 15 years she worked on it, 15 years. And then she got it, and she got it passed. And this year alone, if you look at what it would have been without that law that she got passed, $1 billion more came into the New York City public school system because of it. So don't, have faith in that long game, and try not to get exhausted, because the system is built to exhaust us. I'll be quiet. Any other victories or inspiring stories of advocacy that anyone wants to share?
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is Rebecca. New York City Council just passed a piece of legislation that will require any entity that has 4 or more employees or independent contractors to include salary and wage information on job postings, which will include auditions postings. And so I feel like that's a major win. It's been a conversation in DANC, the Dance Artists National Collective. And so we can continue to advocate for audition postings that don't ask us to pay to be there, and also tell us upfront what we're going to make, because we deserve real jobs. So that's been a major win recently.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Congratulations, and thank you for your work on it. Great.
Yeah, I could speak. This is Kim from the arts education side. Lucy, to your point, sometimes it could feel exhaustive. Like, are we ever going to make any progress as we're going through this? And honestly, it was just as if, like, one day we saw an article that American Rescue Plan Act money was being dedicated in part to arts education as a way of supporting academic recovery, that the education we had done that connected the arts with students' social, emotional well-being, as well as their academic supports that it provides, those threads that we had been weaving over the past year and a half at that point finally came out in fruition and saw some funding movement, and now has laid the groundwork for future advocacy on the topic as well.
Exactly. It lays the groundwork for the next one. Yep. Very good. I don't want to stop anybody from speaking. Does anybody want to say anything? I want to lift up one more question in the chat as well. Another question. Okay. So last question. What about when you operate within an organization that may not be addressing the issues you feel are important to the communities you serve, that the organization serves? How do you balance the obligation to speak up, but also the emotional labor of feeling like the only person speaking up consistently? I can answer with my thoughts, but anyone else want to jump in? I would say you are the first person you're taking care of, right? You do the work that you can do within that organization, and do not spend, if you're spending emotional labor and it is not moving the dial, then you go, okay, that is what they are going to do. And it's going to be entirely frustrating for me to still be here. So is there somewhere else I can work, or is there a way I can work outside of the organization to do some of the things that, or support other work that's happening, maybe with a volunteer organization or something like that. But anyway, I really feel that question, and I don't mean to be light about it, because it's you do, right? We all should speak up within the organizations that we're in, but also you need to protect yourself. You don't need to exhaust yourself and feel again defeated and hopeless if you're unable to change a particular organization, which may have all sorts of history and all sorts of structures which are preventing it from changing. Anyone else want to weigh in on either a victory or a last response to give somebody some energy who's faced in that situation? All right, I think I'm supposed to throw back. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Rebecca, Kim, Diane. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. And please, folks, check out these organizations. If they're useful, ask us for things. It's great if you do work, but it's also ask people who are supposed to be doing this work to do it as well. Give your input. Okay, Sarah, the intrepid and fantastic Sarah Bukowski, are you still with us? Am I throwing back to you?
Yep, here I am. Thank you all so much. I'm really honored to know each of you and to work with y'all. All right, this is Sarah back at you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lucy, you're incredible. Diane, Kim, Ravi, Rebecca, your expertise, your contributions to this conversation, really insightful. And I learned even more things. To our attendees, thank you so much for being avid contributors and for offering your insights and your questions. We welcome you to submit any lingering questions or concerns, comments, affirmations. Submit those on the session follow-up in the community board. You'll also find the resources from my presentation there. A final thank you to our funders and sponsors, and of course to our accessibility service providers. We had Elisa and Beth from Sign Nexus and Cindy from the Viscardi Center. Your support is invaluable. So what's next? You can continue to experience the symposium here on our last day together. You can visit our sponsors in the exhibitor hall. You can create virtual meetups and online conversations right over there on the community board, or take some time away from the screen and rest. To explore some more concepts within life cycles, livelihoods, and legacies, we have 3 more daytime sessions coming up, all at 2:30 p.m. Before that, at 1:30, you can take your lunch, or you can head over to the exhibitor hall for our last virtual expo showcase. Tonight's program includes closing remarks from Dance NYC, artistic offerings by the Clark Center and Hunter College Dance Department, and a pivotal keynote conversation entitled Building Community Around Dance for a Future Society. At an important global tipping point for change, this conversation forecasts what building community around dance will demand of the dance field and of the wider society as we know it. Knowledgeable practitioners in technology, education, producing, and presenting will discuss the world that they're preparing for and how they will serve it. We'll be joined by Adham Hafez, Chris Walker, Kamal Sinclair, and Christopher McDowell on the panel, and moderator Onye Ozuzu. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Cheers, and thanks again.
Thank you for joining today's session. A special thanks to our funders, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Howard Gilman Foundation, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. A special thanks to our lead corporate sponsor, Con Edison, and our lead dance advocate, Jody Gottfried Arnold. Subsidies for the education and dance worker ticket tiers are made possible by the Arnold Foundation. A special thanks to our leader, host, and partner level sponsors, 92nd Street Y, Harkness Dance Center, Dance Education Library, Cataliote Law, Full Out Creative, Gibney Dance Center, Kumbay Center for African and Diaspora Dance, the Actors Fund, Ballet Hispanico, Fit for Dance, Nai Ni Chin Dance Company, NDI Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, New York Live Arts, and Tom O'Connor Consulting Group. And last, but certainly not least, a special thanks to our Justice, Equity, and Inclusion partners, Art Beyond Sight, Art Space Sanctuary, Asian American Arts Alliance, Center for Traditional Music and Dance, the International Association of Blacks in Dance, Lotus Music and Dance, Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium, National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, New York Foundation for the Arts, and Women of Color in the Arts. Up next, please feel free to rest, reflect, and eat a nourishing lunch. You may also check out our virtual expo in the exhibitor hall at this time. At 2:30, we begin our late afternoon sessions, and at 4:15, we gather in our daily debrief. At 6 o'clock, we gather for our final keynote presentation. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSimp, DanceNYC 2022, and DanceSimp2022. On Instagram at dance.nyc, on Twitter at dance.nyc, and on Facebook at dance/NYC. Some features not to miss. Build your agenda of sessions. Connect with other attendees. Join community conversations. Visit the exhibitor hall. Don't forget to check out the 2022 Symposium digital program book. How are we doing? Did you like a session? Use the like feature on your favorite session. Got feedback for us? Take the post-event survey after March 19th and tell us how we did. Need help? Email us at customerservice@dance.nyc. A special thanks to our broadcast streaming partners at Full Out Creative. Thanks for joining. Keep in touch at dance.nyc.